parameters mentioned in the prior segment exist in all EQs, but not every EQ will give you the option to play around with them. The EQ I was using is called a parametric EQ. Parametric EQs let you determine the center frequency, amplitude, Q, and sometimes even more parameters. The more classic form of a parametric EQ will be using knobs, and we'll do the same trick looking a bit different. Another type of EQ is the semi-parametric EQ. This lets you determine the center frequency and amplitude, but not the Q. Oftentimes, the Q varies as the gain of the frequency changes, but this is predetermined by the designer. A third type of EQ is the graphic EQ, which will give a set amount of bands on a set amount of frequencies that you can either boost or attenuate to taste. Like the semi-parametric EQ, the Qs are predetermined and either change with the volume manipulations or don't. Dynamic EQs react to the audio and don't stay completely static. This feature is great since the effects of EQ moves aren't necessarily right throughout a whole song. So dynamic processing might save a lot of automation work, which we will be talking about in a different segment. Linear phase EQs are a potential solution to a side effect that sometimes appears from the traditional EQ design. Analog EQs and quite a lot of plugins are minimum phase EQs. This implies that they have slight time delays, which in turn introduce slight phase shifts that vary by the frequency, filter type, and gain. This is called smearing, and it's more likely to happen when using intrusive EQ moves like very narrow cuts or high-pass, low-pass filters. When smearing is not desirable, linear phase EQs come in handy because they keep everything in time, therefore preventing phase issues. The downside is that they create higher latency than other EQs and might soften transients as well. So this tool has its virtues and trade-offs like any other. Use it when needed, but know the consequences. When it comes to analog EQs or emulations of analog EQs, we need to understand that a big part of the EQ's character comes from its circuitry. Some EQs have tubes in their circuitry and give the audio a bit of tube saturation. Some are solid state and as a result are very clean. Some have a very colorful transistor and that will give them that unique tone. Although modern EQs are practically limitless, the analog emulations are still a big part of the mixing world. So with that in mind, I want to show a few classic EQs you will surely see a lot as you will dive deeper into mixing. I will try my best to explain their logic since some of them are not too intuitive. But before we start, I want to show you a few basic symbols that will just help you get around a new EQ that you are not familiar with. This sign marks a bell-shaped filter. This marks a low shelf. This is a low cut. This marks a high shelf. This is a high cut. And this is the phase flip sign. Let's start with the SSL parametric EQ. This is a British EQ that has 4 bands, which in the default form are low shelf, high shelf, and 2 mid-range bell bands. Some emulations will have one low-cut filter, and some will have another high-cut filter as well. The 2 mid-range bands have a Q knob to them, making the EQ fully parametric, and the high and low shelves have a button that can turn them to bell filters instead of shelves, with a predetermined Q. Here is the SSL in action. Miss my evening strolls. 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 The next classic EQ I want to introduce is the Neve 1073. This semi-parametric EQ is also British and is very famous for being a part of countless influential records that we are all familiar with. This EQ has high and low shelf bands, one mid-range bell band, and a high-pass filter. The frequency of the high shelf is fixed at 12K, while the low shelf frequency has 4 selectable frequencies. The mid-range band has 6 frequencies you can choose from with a fixed Q. An interesting thing to know about this EQ is that the low cut has a bit of resonance to it, which will add a small boost at the chosen frequency point. This can be used to fatten up a source while still filtering the really low frequencies. Another classic Neve EQ is the 1081, which has one more bell band in the mid-range, more frequencies to choose from, 2 Q options for the mid-bands, as well as the option to change the shelf bands to bell, and a high-cut filter. Here are the 1073 and 1081 in action. Miss my evening strolls. 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 Next EQ will be the API 560 graphic EQ. This is an American EQ with 10 bands jumping in octaves, meaning that the frequencies are doubled from one band to the next. The Q narrows as the boost gets more extreme, giving this EQ a very musical and pleasant sound. This feature will also be found on API's semi-parametric EQs, which are the 550A and 550B. You have probably noticed that the 550B has another band, but the frequencies on the EQs are slightly different, so they will be serving different purposes. They both give the option to change the high and low bands from shelf to bell, and the 550A also has a bandpass filter, cutting anything below 50 Hz and anything above 15K. The frequencies are chosen using the inner blue knob and the gain by the outer white knob. Here are the API 560 and 550 in action. The last classic EQ will be the Pultec. This tube EQ was designed in 1951 and became a classic because of its unique tone and features. The low frequencies can be manipulated with two shelving filters that attenuate and boost simultaneously, therefore creating a unique filter shape that cannot be achieved otherwise. The next band is bell-shaped and can be used to boost selected frequencies between 3 and 16K. This band also has a bandwidth knob, which is the Q, and can adjust the bell to be very sharp or very broad as desired. Finally, there's a high shelf that can only be used for attenuation. This weird-looking, unintuitive EQ was a big part of some Beatles and Motown recordings, as well as countless other historical productions. Here is the Pultec in action. There are many more EQs to learn about, but these few are a good introduction into the classic EQ world. These tools are not a necessity if you want to start mixing, since stock EQs are more than enough. The emulations are just fun to use, but have nothing to do with acquiring skills as a mixer. That being said, they are interesting as they have helped developing this art form as we know it, so familiarity is useful. Now I want to present two tasks, one for this segment and one concluding the EQ subject. The first is relevant only if you have built-in analog emulations in your DAW or if you have any third-party plugins. Start by inserting 3 different analog emulations on a track and figure out what bands they offer, what frequencies they let you manipulate, and which controls you have over the bands. The limitations some analog gear presents is actually what makes them so unique. So try noticing what each has to offer. After the interface is figured out, compare the emulations. Even if the bands are not fixed at the same frequencies, raise the high shelf 3 dB and AB their reactions. Then compare the low bands, the mid bands, the filters, etc. Remembering what each analog gear has to offer will make it easier for you to approach it when you need it. The deeper you go, the more you'll know. So after you're done with these 3 plugins, do the same with a different batch. The second task will be to try and mix a rhythm section of a song, meaning the drums and bass. The EQing tasks only include single tracks, but a mix is a complex puzzle and working in solo is not the way to go. The rhythm section will have frequencies ranging from lowest to highest, so it's a good place to start with. Notice the low end and figure out if you'll clean the bass's sub-frequencies in order to leave it for the kick or the other way around. If the arrangement is good, the tracks will tell you themselves. Then notice the mid-range. How does the basses meet, so to say, interact with the snare or higher tones of the kick? Then notice the highs. Is the track calling for shiny hi-hats or relatively dark ones? Notice how altering frequencies affect the feel of the groove and the emotion of the song as well.